This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about what happens when the system decides the answer before it ever looks at the evidence. When truth is no longer discovered, but issued. Quietly. Officially. Nothing here explodes all at once. There is no single moment where alarms go off. Instead, something far more dangerous happens. The machinery keeps moving. Paperwork continues. Statements are released. And the outcome is already locked in. You are told there is an investigation, but the conclusion arrives first. Facts are allowed in only if they agree. Anything else becomes noise. This is how institutions stop asking questions without ever admitting it. This is how lethal decisions become administrative routine. If you think this only matters when you're watching closely, it doesn't. It matters most when you aren't. Stay with me. Because once you see how this system actually works, you can't unsee it. And what comes next explains why stopping early is exactly what it counts on. What actually controls this system is not law, not evidence, not even procedure. It is hierarchy. When power sits at the top and speaks first, everything below it reorganizes itself. Agencies do not investigate upward. They align downward. Once a conclusion is announced from the highest level, every institution underneath receives the same silent instruction. Do not contradict. Do not complicate. Do not surprise. This is not conspiracy. It is incentive. Careers depend on harmony. Budgets depend on loyalty. Silence becomes professionalism. An investigation, in theory, is meant to discover what happened. In this system, it exists to confirm what has already been said. The process still looks legitimate from the outside. Files are opened. Statements are drafted. Timelines are promised. But the question has already been narrowed to one acceptable answer. And once that happens, truth is no longer something you find. It is something you manage. That shift, subtle, procedural, almost invisible, is where the real danger begins. Because now the system isn't malfunctioning. It's working exactly as designed. And the next step shows how dissent is quietly engineered out of existence. The most dangerous changes never arrive suddenly. They arrive gradually. They arrive quietly, and then one day they feel normal. There was a time when conclusions waited for evidence. When investigators spoke last, not first. When authority followed facts, not the other way around. That time did not end with an announcement. It faded. Procedures were adjusted. Exceptions were justified. Language softened. Nothing broke. Nothing stopped working. It simply shifted. Investigations stopped being about uncertainty. They became about risk control, about minimizing exposure, about avoiding outcomes that would disrupt the chain above them. This is how truth loses its urgency. Not because it is disproven, but because it becomes inconvenient. Once that happens, evidence is no longer dangerous because it is wrong. It is dangerous because it exists, and the system adapts accordingly. What follows is not chaos. It is coordination. And when a real-world shock finally hits something visible, something undeniable, the system does not panic. It closes ranks because it has already practiced for this moment. And that first shock is where everything becomes impossible to unsee. Then the shock arrives, not as a mystery, not as a question, as a declaration. Before any independent review, before procedures complete, before the evidence is allowed to speak, a conclusion is announced publicly, definitively. You are told what happened. You are told why it happened. And you are told there is nothing left to determine. Video exists, but it does not matter because the video is not being used to find the truth. It is being used to prove a point already decided. This is the moment the system shows its hand. An investigation that starts with an answer is not an investigation. It is a performance. And once that performance begins, every step that follows is designed not to clarify, but to protect. Protect the narrative, protect the hierarchy, protect the outcome. If this were really about facts, the process would widen. More eyes, more voices, more scrutiny. Instead, it does the opposite. It narrows, and what happens next explains why the doors quietly close just when accountability should begin. Here is how the system actually protects itself. Not by lying loudly, by choosing what not to do. Real investigations create records, statements, timelines, commitments that can be challenged later. This one avoids them. Key steps are skipped. Questions are delayed. Witnesses remain undefined, not because answers are unavailable, but because answers are dangerous. Every unanswered question keeps options open. Every missing record reduces future risk. This is not incompetence. It is discipline. When an investigation refuses to lock facts in place, it is preserving flexibility for the institution, not clarity for the public. The absence of evidence is not a failure here. It is the objective because evidence has weight, and weight creates gravity, and gravity pulls accountability downward. So the system floats instead, above timelines, above responsibility, above consequence. Those inside understand exactly what this buys them. No contradictions, no sworn statements, no fixed truth that can later be used against them. This is how damage is absorbed without ever being acknowledged. And once this mechanism is in motion, escalation becomes almost effortless. Because the next decision doesn't feel like a cover-up. It feels like caution. And that's where the second shock lands. Then the pace changes. Decisions compress. Silence hardens. The window for correction closes. Critical steps are not delayed. They are removed. No full accounting. No locked testimony. No material release that could later contradict the story. What should be examined becomes radioactive. Because once something is written down, it can be compared. Once it is compared, it can be disproven. So nothing is fixed in place. The system moves forward without anchoring itself to facts. That is not paralysis. That is acceleration. From the outside, it looks careful. From the inside, it feels urgent. Every hour that passes without a record makes reversal harder. Every day without disclosure normalizes the outcome. This is the moment where truth does not disappear. It becomes unreachable. And when that happens, the damage is no longer procedural. It becomes human. Because someone always absorbs the cost of institutional caution. And the next part is where that cost finally becomes visible. Not on paper, but in real life. This is the point where it reaches you. Not as theory, not as policy, as proximity. Because when systems protect themselves this way, they do it by shifting risk downward, away from institutions, onto people who never agreed to carry it. You are told this is rare, that it's exceptional, that it only happens under extreme circumstances. But what you are actually watching is a routine being normalized, a life reduced to a variable, a death absorbed as administrative noise. And the message is quiet but unmistakable. If the system needs an ending, it will choose one. You do not have to be reckless. You do not have to be dangerous. You only have to be present at the wrong moment, inside a process that has already decided how the story ends. That is why this matters beyond the details. Because once a system proves it can do this once, it does not stop there. Stay with me. Because what happens next is how this kind of outcome stops being local, stops being isolated, and starts rippling outward into places you were told were insulated from it. What happens here does not stay contained. Because systems watch each other. They learn. They adapt. When one institution proves it can pre-decide outcomes and survive the exposure, others take note. Not publicly, operationally. The lesson spreads quietly. Control the narrative early. Centralize the process. Limit participants. Delay disclosure. Soon this stops being an exception. It becomes a template across agencies, across jurisdictions. across borders where federal authority meets local reality. The rule is no longer about what the evidence shows. It's about who gets to speak first and who is locked out afterward. And once that logic scales, accountability fractures because responsibility becomes distributed just enough that no single actor appears to own the outcome. Everyone followed procedure. Everyone stayed within their lane. Everyone points upward or sideways, and the system keeps moving. At that point, this is no longer about one event or one investigation. It is about a structural signal being sent outward. This is how power protects itself now. What remains uncertain is not whether this spreads. It already has. The uncertainty is how far it goes. And what happens when the next decision arrives faster than the system can pretend it's still neutral? From here, the system has three paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration, language changes. Processes are refined just enough to absorb criticism without surrendering control. Nothing fundamental shifts. The system survives by becoming harder to question. The second is erosion. Confidence drains slowly. Each repetition makes the outcome feel less shocking. People stop expecting clarity. Institutions lose credibility one decision at a time, not in collapse, but in fatigue. And then there is rupture. That happens when the next case arrives faster, louder, more visible, when evidence refuses to stay contained, when the machinery designed to manage truth can no longer keep pace with it. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It arrives as confusion, as contradiction, as the sudden realization that no version of the story holds. Which path unfolds is not decided by intent. It's decided by pressure, by repetition, by how often this system is asked to protect itself instead of answer questions. Nothing here guarantees accountability. Nothing here guarantees impunity. What it guarantees is acceleration. Because once truth becomes optional, every future decision arrives with less friction. And the final part is where that acceleration runs into its most absolute limit. There is one power the system keeps in reserve. It is silent, total, and irreversible. It does not argue with evidence. It does not review findings. It does not wait for timelines. It erases outcomes. Even a perfect investigation can be nullified. Even a proven sequence can be wiped clean. Even accountability, fully assembled, can be switched off in a moment. That is what makes this dangerous. Not because it happens often, but because it only has to happen once to teach the system a lesson. If consequences can be removed at the end, behavior changes at the beginning. Decisions become looser. Thresholds drop. Risk migrates downward away from power and toward everyone else. You are not being asked to panic. You are being asked to notice, because this is not about one case reaching closure. It is about a system discovering how little it needs to explain itself. And once that discovery is made, it is rarely unlearned. If you want to understand where this goes next, how often this logic is already being reused, and what it looks like when the override becomes routine, stay here. Follow the thread, because the most important stories now are the ones that never fully resolve.